Welcome back. In the previous video, we learned about HEPGA as a system lens for understanding education. We also asked where the educational system receives its overall direction from. To answer this question, we begin with the macro level, which represents the broadest level of educational policy and governance, and where system-wide decisions are made. As shown at the bottom of the diagram, macro-level actors often include governments, ministries, or departments of education, and governing bodies such as school boards or university boards. These actors are responsible for making decisions that affect large parts of the educational system rather than individual classrooms or schools. The macro level is often associated with four key functions. First is policy. Macro-level actors establish policies that define goals, priorities, expectations, and rules. Second is authority. They possess the formal authority to make decisions and create structures through which educational systems operate. Third is resources. Macro-level decisions determine how funding, staffing, programs, and other supports are distributed across the system. And fourth is direction. Macro actors establish long-term visions and strategic priorities that influence educational development over time. The downward arrows in the diagram are important. They remind us that decisions made at the macro level influence what happens at other levels of the system, including schools, departments, teachers, students, and communities. This does not mean that influence only moves downward. As we will discuss later, educational systems are more dynamic than a simple hierarchy. However, understanding the macro level helps us identify where many of the board structures, priorities, and expectations originate from. The key takeaway is that the macro level represents the highest level of educational decision making. It is the level at which policy, authority, resources, and direction are established for the educational system as a whole. Understanding the macro level requires us to distinguish between two closely related concepts, policy and governance. As we've learned previously, these concepts should be discussed together because they are deeply interconnected but perform different functions. While policies help answer questions such as what should education accomplish, who should have access to educational opportunities, what standards should schools, colleges, or universities follow, governance refers to how decisions are made and how authority is exercised within the system. While policy establishes direction, governance creates the structures and processes that make collective decision-making possible. An important point emphasized in HEPGA is that policy and governance should not be viewed as separate processes. They depend on one another. This is why the center of the slide highlights the relationship between the two. Policy needs governance, governance implements policy. Together, they shape how educational systems operate and evolve over time. The key takeaway is that policy and governance are complementary dimensions of educational systems. Understanding both is essential for understanding the macro level. In the previous slide, we distinguished between policy and governance, but a critical question remains. Who has the authority to make policy and governance decisions in the first place? At the macro level, power and authority are concentrated in actors who have formal responsibility for guiding the education system, which include governments, ministries, governing bodies, or other influential organizations. Power at the macro level is not simply about influence. It is also about authority, which refers to the legitimate right to make decisions, establish policies, allocate resources, and create rules that others are expected to follow. As shown in the center of the slide, macro-level authority influences educational systems through several important mechanisms. It shapes policies and laws, determines how resources are distributed, establishes rules and regulations, and sets priorities and a strategic direction for the system. These decisions affect what schools, colleges, universities, educators, and learners are able to do. In other words, macro-level authority helps shape the conditions within which educational practice occurs. The right side of the slide highlights several characteristics of macro-level power. First, it is based on legitimate authority. Governments and governing bodies derive their authority from laws, mandates, regulations, and other formal responsibilities. Secondly, macro-level power has system-wide impact. A decision made at the macro level often affects large numbers of organizations, educators, and learners simultaneously. Thirdly, macro actors exercise control over resources. Funding decisions, staffing allocations, infrastructure investments, and support programs are often determined at this level. And finally, macro actors engage in agenda setting. Not every issue receives equal attention. By deciding which problems deserve attention and which problems become priorities, macro actors influence what the educational system focuses on and values. One important insight from HEPGA is that power is not exercised only through formal policies. Power is also exercised through decisions about funding, priorities, accountability systems, governance structures, and the issues that are considered important. What do macro-level decisions look like in practice and how they influence educational systems? Macro-level decisions take many forms. They may involve the creation of new policies and laws, changes to funding and resource allocation, the introduction of new regulations, or the establishment of strategic priorities for the education system. These decisions often appear distant from classrooms and learners, but their effects can be far-reaching. The examples shown in the second column illustrate this point. A government may introduce a national curriculum. It may increase or decrease education funding. It may establish accountability requirements or prioritize specific areas such as STEM education, Indigenous education, inclusion, or workforce development. The third column shows how these decisions influence the educational system. They establish direction and expectations, determine how resources are distributed, create requirements for accountability and oversight, and influence where attention, effort, and investment are focused. As these decisions move through the system, they begin to shape the experiences of different actors. Schools and educational institutions may need to adjust programs and practices. Educators may be required to adopt new approaches, follow new standards, or respond to new accountability measures. Students experience the effects through curriculum, assessment practices, support services, and learning opportunities. And communities may also be affected through changing educational priorities and access resources. The final column reminds us that these decisions ultimately influence broader outcomes. They can affect educational access, influence quality, either strengthen or weaken equity, and shape the overall outcomes experienced by learners and communities. HEPGA encourages us to avoid assuming that outcomes are determined solely by policy decisions. The same policy can produce different results in different contexts. This is why the idea at the bottom of the slide is important. Context matters. Throughout this video, we've explored the macro level as the broadest level of educational policy and governance. At this point, it is important to ask a critical question. How useful is a macro level perspective for understanding education? Like any analytical lens, it offers important strengths, but it also has limitations. One of the greatest advantages is that it provides a big picture perspective. It helps us understand how educational systems are organized and how decisions are coordinated across large numbers of institutions and stakeholders. It also helps us reveal system-wide priorities. We can identify what governments and governing bodies consider important and how those priorities shape educational policy and practice. Another strength is that it highlights structures, systems, and rules. Rather than focusing only on individual actors, it directs our attention to the policies, regulations, funding mechanisms, and governance arrangements that influence educational outcomes. And finally, macro analysis helps us understand system-wide impacts. We can examine issues such as access, equity, accountability, and resource distribution from a broader perspective. And this can be particularly useful when studying large-scale educational reforms and policy changes. However, macro-level analysis also has important limitations. Because it focuses on broad structures and system-wide processes, it may overlook local realities. We know that educational policies are experienced differently in different schools, communities, and organizations, so a macro-level perspective does not always capture these differences. It may also give less attention to individual experiences and voices. Teachers, students, families, and local leaders often experience policies in ways that cannot be fully understood through system-level analysis alone. Another limitation is that macro-analysis may miss informal practices and relationships. As we will discuss later in this module, many educational decisions are influenced by culture, local norms, and shadow policies that operate outside formal governance structures. These influences are often difficult to see from a purely macro perspective. And finally, outcomes do not emerge from policy alone. The same policy can produce very different results depending on how it is interpreted, implemented, and adapted within particular contexts. This means that educational outcomes are shaped not only by macro-level decisions, but also by what happens at other levels of the system. This insight leads us to the focus of the next video. If the macro level establishes direction for the system, who translates those policies into organizational action?